Hello, everyone. In this episode, let's have a radical dive into the work of Daniel Guerin.
Keep it radical, keep it revolutionary.
You know it. We're diving deep into his book, Fascism and Big Business. It was first published back in 1936. It's fascinating how this book, written almost a century ago, can still feel so relevant today.
It really is.
You know, we often hear that fascism was this spontaneous outburst of popular rage, like a reaction to economic hardship or social upheaval.
Right.
But Guerin challenges that narrative, doesn't he?
He absolutely does. He argues that fascism wasn't some fringe movement that hijacked the system. Instead, it was cultivated and financed by the very forces it claimed to oppose.
Oh, wow. So big business.
Big business, exactly. Guerin argues that powerful industrialists,
Right.
especially those in heavy industries like steel and armaments, they saw fascism as a tool to crush the labor movement
Interesting.
and secure their own profits.
So it wasn't just ideological alignment.
Right.
It was a calculated move to protect their economic interests.
Exactly. Imagine you're a steel magnate in the 1920s. You're facing rising labor unrest. Strikes that cripple production
Right.
and demands for better wages and working conditions.
Yeah.
Suddenly, this movement comes along, promising to restore order, smash unions,
Wow.
and create a docile workforce. It's a tempting proposition,
Right.
even if it means embracing a radical ideology that on the surface seems to oppose everything you stand for.
It's almost Machiavellian, isn't it? Using the very forces that threaten you to consolidate your own power.
It is. It is.
And Guerin provides compelling evidence to support his claims.
He does.
He digs into the financial ties between fascist parties and major corporations.
Yeah.
Showing how industrialists poured money into these movements, first discreetly,
Right.
then quite openly once they realized the potential benefits.
Yeah.
And what about the workers? How did they get drawn into this?
Right.
Because on the surface, fascism's message seems so contradictory. They're promising to protect the little guy
Yeah.
while simultaneously serving the interests of the elites. How do those two things go together?
That's where the deception comes in.
Okay.
Fascist leaders like Mussolini and Hitler,
Right.
they were masters of propaganda and manipulation.
They were.
They understood the power of resentment, the frustration of people struggling to make ends meet.
Yeah.
They skillfully tapped into existing prejudices,
Okay.
scapegoating minorities, immigrants,
Right.
and anyone who seemed different or threatening. And they offered this seductive vision of national unity,
Okay.
a return to a mythical past where everyone knew their place
Right.
and society functioned harmoniously.
It's a classic bait and switch, isn't it?
Yeah.
Promise the world
Right.
and deliver something far more sinister.
Precisely.
And Guerin doesn't shy away from exposing this hypocrisy.
He doesn't.
He meticulously documents how, once in power, fascist regimes systematically dismantled labor unions, suppressed wages, outlawed strikes.
Yes.
They essentially turned workers into cogs in a giant machine, serving the interests of the state and its corporate allies. He even uses this striking phrase, socialism for the rich,
Oh, yeah.
to describe the economic policies of fascist regimes.
Right.
What did he mean by that?
I think it's a brilliant encapsulation of the reality of fascist economics.
Okay.
On the one hand, they cracked down on any form of socialism that aimed to empower the working class.
Right.
But on the other hand, they were perfectly happy to use the power of the state to prop up failing businesses,
Okay.
provide subsidies to favored industries,
Right.
and fund massive rearmament programs.
Interesting.
All of this, of course, came at the expense of ordinary people,
Right.
faced higher taxes, lower wages, and dwindling social services.
It sounds like a perversion of the very idea of socialism.
It does.
It's taking the tools of economic intervention and using them,
Yeah.
not to uplift the masses, but to enrich the already wealthy and powerful.
Exactly.
And that's why Guerin's analysis is so important. He helps us see through the propaganda
He does.
and understand the underlying economic forces at play.
Right.
He shows how fascism, despite its populist rhetoric,
Yeah.
ultimately served to entrench the power of the elites and crush any genuine attempt at social and economic justice. And what about those who actually believed in the fascist message?
Yeah.
The ones who marched in the streets
Right.
and helped bring these regimes to power.
Right.
Guerin talks about the Plebians.
He does.
What did he mean by that term?
He uses Plebians to describe those who formed the rank and file of fascist movements.
Okay.
The street fighters, the true believers,
Yeah.
often drawn from the lower middle class or the ranks of disgruntled war veterans.
Interesting.
They were attracted to the simplistic solutions, the scapegoating of outsiders,
Right.
and the promise of restoring national glory.
Yeah.
They provided the muscle, the energy.
And the revolutionary zeal that propelled these movements to power.
It's a tragic irony, isn't it? They thought they were fighting for a better world,
Right.
but they ended up being pawns in a game orchestrated by forces far more powerful than themselves.
Absolutely.
And Guerin doesn't let them off the hook entirely.
No.
He argues that their willingness to embrace violence,
Yeah.
their intolerance of dissent,
Right.
and their blind faith in charismatic leaders made them complicit in the rise of fascism. But he also acknowledges that they were, to a large extent, victims of circumstance,
Yeah.
manipulated by forces they didn't fully understand.
Right.
So they are both perpetrators and victims.
In a sense, yes.
And that's what makes Guerin's analysis so nuanced.
It is.
He doesn't offer easy answers or simplistic judgments.
Oh.
He forces us to confront the complexities of history,
Right.
to see how individuals can be both agents of change and pawns in a larger game, and what happened to these plebeians once the fascists were in power. That's where another layer of betrayal comes in.
Okay.
Once the regime was firmly established, those radical elements,
Right.
the ones who believed in the revolutionary potential of fascism, became a liability.
Interesting.
They were too unpredictable, too independent,
Right.
too much of a threat to the stability that the elites craved.
So what happened to them?
They were systematically sidelined, purged,
Right.
absorbed into the state apparatus, or simply disappeared.
Oh, wow.
The very people who had helped bring the fascists to power
Right.
were now seen as a threat to the new order they had created.
It's a chilling reminder of how revolutions can devour their own children. The ideals that ignite a movement are often the first casualties once power is achieved.
They are.
And it speaks to a larger theme in Guerin's work,
Yeah.
the danger of mistaking rhetoric for reality,
Right.
of being seduced by simplistic solutions and charismatic leaders. He urges us to look beyond the surface,
He does.
to examine the underlying economic and social forces at play.
Yes.
It's a powerful message, especially in a world where misinformation and propaganda are rampant.
Absolutely.
It reminds us that we need to be critical thinkers, to question the narratives we're being sold,
Right.
and to always be wary of those who promise easy answers to complex problems.
Exactly. And that's what makes Guerin's work so relevant even today. He provides us with tools to understand not just the fascism of the past, but the potential for its resurgence in new and unexpected forms.
Okay.
You know, it's fascinating how Guerin dives into the very DNA of fascist ideology. He argues that it wasn't really anything new.
Okay.
Instead, he sees it as a rehash of old reactionary ideas,
Why what?
like a throwback to feudalism and absolutism. It's almost like a yearning for a simpler time, a time of rigid hierarchies and unquestioning obedience.
So it's not just a rejection of modernity,
Right.
but a regression to a more primitive way of thinking.
Exactly. Fascist thinkers reject reason and progress. They glorify violence and fetishize the rule of a strong man.
Right.
They see democracy and individual liberty as weaknesses, as threats to the natural order of things.
It's like a romanticization of the past, a longing for a world that never truly existed.
That's a great way to put it.
And this back to the future ideology, as Guerin calls it,
Right.
helps explain why fascist movements are so drawn to symbols of strength, purity, and tradition.
It does.
Right. And this ties into Guerin's analysis of the myth of youth in fascist ideology, doesn't it?
It does.
He talks about how they glorify youth,
Yeah.
how they create these elaborate youth organizations to indoctrinate young people.
Right.
Why is that?
It's a brilliant insight.
Yeah.
See, young people are often idealistic, easily swayed by appeals to emotion and grand narratives.
Right.
They haven't yet developed the critical thinking skills to see through propaganda or to question authority, and that makes them perfect targets for fascist recruitment.
It's chilling to think about.
It is.
They're essentially molding young minds,
Right.
creating a generation predisposed to embrace authoritarianism. And that's why Guerin emphasizes the importance of education,
Yeah.
of critical thinking, as a bulwark against fascism. He argues that we need to equip young people with the tools to resist manipulation,
Yes.
to question the narratives they're being fed, and to think for themselves.
Right.
But Guerin doesn't just focus on the perpetrators of fascism.
Mhm.
He also explores its appeal,
He
why it
does.
resonates with certain segments of society.
Uh-huh.
And it's not just the uneducated or the easily manipulated, is it?
Not at all.
So who is it?
Guerin argues that fascism can attract intellectuals,
What artists?
even members of the working class. It's a complex phenomenon, and the motivations can vary widely.
Why would intellectuals, people who are supposed to value reason and critical thinking, be drawn to fascism?
It's a fascinating question.
It is.
Guerin suggests that some intellectuals might be disillusioned
Okay.
with the perceived failures of liberalism,
Ah,
with its emphasis on individualism and materialism.
okay.
They might see fascism as a more authentic, more spiritual alternative,
Right.
one that emphasizes community, tradition, and a higher purpose.
So it's like a rejection of the Enlightenment project, a yearning for something more transcendent.
In a way, yes.
And this appeal to the irrational,
Right.
to emotion over reason, can be quite powerful,
It can.
especially in times of crisis or uncertainty.
Right.
And what about the working class? Why would they support a movement that ultimately serves the interests of their exploiters?
That's the tragedy of fascism, isn't it?
It is.
Guerin argues that workers feeling abandoned by traditional left-wing parties
Okay.
might be lured by fascism's promises of economic justice and national unity.
So they're being sold a false bill of goods, a promise of solidarity that masks the reality of their exploitation.
Exactly.
And Guerin points out that fascist movements are particularly adept
Right.
at exploiting existing social divisions.
Yeah.
Pitting workers against each other based on race, religion, or national origin, they create a false sense of unity. We're all in this together mentality,
Right.
while simultaneously deepening the very inequalities that benefit the elites. It's a classic divide and conquer strategy, isn't it?
It is.
Turn the working class against itself.
Yeah.
And they'll never unite to challenge the true sources of their oppression.
Precisely.
And that's why Guerin emphasizes the importance of class consciousness,
He does.
of workers recognizing their shared interests
Right.
and uniting across these artificial divisions. He argues that a strong and unified working class movement is the most effective bulwark against fascism. It's not just about resisting fascism.
Right.
It's about creating a more just and equitable society. One where the working class has a genuine voice and a share in the fruits of their labor.
Absolutely.
And that's where Guerin's analysis goes beyond simply dissecting the mechanics of fascism. He offers a vision of a better world,
He does.
a world where exploitation is eradicated, where solidarity triumphs over division, and where the human spirit is liberated from the shackles of oppression.
Right.
It's an inspiring vision.
It is.
But how do we get there? Guerin talks about the tactics that fascist movements use to gain power.
Yeah.
What are some of the key things we need to be aware of?
Guerin highlights the strategic blend of populism and violence that fascists employ. They appeal to the frustrations of the masses,
Right.
particularly the middle class, who feel squeezed and betrayed by the system. They offer simple solutions, scapegoats to blame, and a promise to restore a lost golden age.
Right.
Exactly. And they don't just talk the talk, they also walk the walk. Guerin points out how they use their paramilitary organizations, like the black shirts in Italy and the brown shirts in Germany, to intimidate rivals, disrupt meetings, and create a climate of fear.
It's the classic bully tactic, isn't it? Silence dissent through violence and intimidation.
Precisely.
And this violence isn't random. It's targeted.
Right.
They go after labor organizers, left-wing activists, journalists, intellectuals, anyone who dares to challenge their authority or their ideology. They create chaos and exploit it to their advantage.
They do.
It's a disturbingly effective playbook.
It is.
And it's one that we need to be aware of.
Right.
Guerin reminds us that fascists are masters of opportunism. They can shift their rhetoric and tactics depending on the audience and the circumstances. So they can be all things to all people, adapting their message to exploit specific grievances and anxieties.
Yes, and this flexibility, this ability to morph and adapt makes them even more dangerous.
Guerin spends a lot of time dissecting this idea of fascist mysticism.
He does.
What do you mean by that?
This is where Guerin delves into the psychological appeal of fascism. He explores how they tap into deep-seated human needs and desires, offering a kind of secular religion complete with its own rituals, symbols, and mythology.
It's more than just politics. It's almost like a cult.
You've hit the nail on the head. They cultivate a cult of personality around their leaders,
Right.
portraying them as messianic figures destined to restore national greatness.
Wow.
They offer simple answers to complex problems,
Right.
promising to restore order,
Hmm.
revive national pride, and cleanse society of its perceived impurities.
It's a seductive message, especially in times of crisis,
It is.
when people are yearning for meaning, belonging, and a sense of purpose.
Absolutely.
And they skillfully exploit this longing, channeling it towards their own ends.
They do.
But Guerin also points out that fascist regimes, once in control, tend to follow a predictable pattern. What happens once they seize power?
Once in power, fascist regimes move quickly to dismantle democratic institutions,
Okay.
suppress dissent, and establish totalitarian control over all aspects of society.
Mm-hmm.
They crush independent unions, outlaw strikes,
Mm-hmm.
and imprison or execute political opponents.
Wow.
The media is brought under strict state control, right?
And any form of opposition is ruthlessly suppressed.
Hmm.
It's the end of freedom as we know it.
It is.
It's a nightmare scenario.
Yeah.
And Guerin argues that this totalitarian control extends to the economy as well.
Absolutely.
So how did that work?
While fascist regimes might pay lip service to private property
Okay.
and individual initiative,
Right.
they ultimately subordinate the economy to the needs of the state, particularly its military ambitions.
Okay.
They intervene in the market, manipulate prices,
Mm.
and direct investment towards industries deemed essential for national power, especially armaments.
So it's a kind of state-controlled capitalism, a system where the interests of the elites are paramount.
Exactly.
And this control comes at a high price.
It does.
Individual freedoms are sacrificed. Economic inequality is exacerbated.
Yeah.
And the entire society is geared towards war and conquest.
Right.
It's a bleak picture.
It is.
But amidst all this darkness, does Guerin offer any glimmer of hope?
He does.
Does he see any way to resist this seemingly inevitable march towards authoritarianism?
He does. Guerin argues that fascism, despite its seductive appeal and its initial successes, ultimately contains the seeds of its own destruction.
How so?
Guerin points out that fascist regimes, by their very nature,
Oh.
create internal contradictions and tensions that can ultimately lead to their downfall. Their reliance on violence and repression
Right.
creates resentment and resistance even among those who initially supported them.
Okay.
Their economic policies, often focused on military spending and autarky,
Right.
lead to shortages, inflation, and economic stagnation. And their grandiose promises of national greatness often clash with the harsh realities of life under totalitarian rule.
So they create unsustainable systems, both economically and politically.
Yes, and that's Guerin's point.
Okay.
He argues that fascist regimes, while they might enjoy periods of success and popularity, are ultimately built on a foundation of lies and illusions.
Right.
And these lies, these illusions, eventually crumble under the weight of their own contradictions.
It's a reminder that even the most powerful dictatorships are ultimately fragile. They might seem invincible, but they're built on a foundation of sand.
Exactly.
And that's where Guerin's analysis offers a ray of hope. He reminds us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit of resistance and the longing for freedom can never be entirely
They
extinguished.
can't.
It's both terrifying and reassuring, isn't it? To know that these regimes, as monstrous as they are, ultimately sow the seeds of their own destruction.
Right.
But that still leaves us with a question. What can we do to prevent them from taking root in the first place?
Right.
Guerin doesn't just leave us with a diagnosis.
No.
He offers a prescription, doesn't he?
He does, and it's a radical one.
Okay, let's hear it.
Guerin argues that simply defending the status quo isn't enough. We need to address the root causes of fascism,
Yeah.
the social and economic injustices that create fertile ground for its growth.
Right.
He believes that the most effective antidote is a strong and united working class movement, one that champions economic justice, social equality, and democratic participation.
So it's not just about fighting fascism. It's about building a better world, a more just and equitable society where the seeds of fascism can't take root.
Exactly. It's about creating a world where everyone has a stake, where everyone has a voice,
Okay.
and where the concentration of power, whether in the hands of the state or corporations, is kept in check. He believed that a society that prioritizes the needs of the many over the greed of the few would be far less susceptible to the allure of fascism.
It sounds like a tall order,
It does.
but it's a vision worth striving for.
It is.
But even if we create a more just society,
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't there always be a risk of fascism emerging? Of those who seek power exploiting people's fears and anxieties?
Of course, there's no foolproof solution.
Right.
No way to completely eliminate the risk.
Okay.
But Guerin reminds us that fascism doesn't always announce itself with jackboots and swastikas.
Wow.
It can adapt, evolve, and take on new forms to suit the anxieties of the time.
So we need to be vigilant to recognize the patterns of the past,
Yes.
even when they're disguised in new packages.
Precisely.
Hmm.
We need to be aware of the warning signs. The demonization of minorities,
Right.
the erosion of democratic norms,
Okay.
the suppression of dissent, the concentration of power, and the elevation of emotion over reason. These are the hallmarks of fascism, regardless of the specific ideology or rhetoric being used.
It's a sobering reminder that the fight against fascism is never truly over.
It isn't.
It requires constant vigilance, critical thinking,
Mm.
and a willingness to speak out against injustice wherever we see it.
Right.
It's not just about defending democracy, it's about actively building a better world.
It is.
A world where fascism has no place to take root.
Well said.
Hmm.
And remember, as Guerin reminds us,
Okay.
history isn't predetermined.
Right.
The future is shaped by the choices we make,
Mm.
the actions we take, and the struggles we engage in.
Mm.
The fight against fascism is a fight for the soul of humanity.
Right.
And it's a fight we can win.
Mm.
Keep it radical, keep it revolutionary.
And keep on learning.
Yes.
That's what the deep dive is all about. Until next time, everyone.